and welcome back to ATA's EconChat, brought to you by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I am your host, ATA Chief Economist John Humphreys, and I am joined by Gene Tunny, Adept Economics founder and director. How you doing, Gene?
Good, John. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Another beautiful day in paradise up here.
Exactly.
We're both based in Brisbane. For all the rest of you unfortunate misfits or near Brisbane. So, Gene, you missed out on last week, but I imagine you were listening in intently. Indeed, I saw your comment come in. Any thoughts?
Yes, yeah. I thought, that was great. You and Barclay were having a great chat about, was it black sovereignty, and also about voluntary super. So I thought that was really good, and yeah, gave me a lot to think about there. I mean, clearly, how we've set up our retirement income system is not optimal at the moment. And I mean, super, I think, was well intentioned when we went into it, but the way that it's evolved and all of the various tax concessions for it mean that it's really not achieving what it was intended to. So I think, there's a good case to be made for voluntary super for sure.
But surely good intentions are all we need in public policy, Gene. I mean, none of that pesky assessing the benefits and the costs and working out if it works in reality. Just good intentions and good vibes. And that's normally how it works. For those listening at home, if you want to go back and check that old episode, they are available on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Rumble. If you check out our channels, and please, while I'm saying it, please like what you're watching right now. Please share if you can, and subscribe to the channels. This is being simulcast through the Australian Taxpayers Alliance pages, my personal pages, John Humphreys, and The Good Source. So please go and give all of those a like, give all of those a follow. You can find them all on the YouTubes and my personal page on Rumble as well for the inevitable day when we all get deplatformed. So please give us a like, give us a follow. At some stage, Gene, I should find out what your YouTube channel is and also chuck that up so that people can follow you as well. This is a live, casual, and interactive session. Casual, as in this is unscripted. We don't know what we're saying often, even when we start the sentences. I don't know how it's going to end. I didn't know that one, for instance. So expect there to be mistakes, expect it to go off topic, and expect us to ask each other questions that we hadn't prepared for. So that can be fun. And by interactive, I mean that this is being live streamed to YouTube and Facebook. If you are watching it on either of those channels, you can type a comment in as we're going. We can see those comments as we go, and we can put them up on the screen. We can interact. So please do chuck in some comments, some criticisms, some questions, anything else starting with the K sound, and feel free to try and distract us. We are very open to going down any garden path. If people come up with a question that's better than the ones we ask each other, we'll go with your question. So feel free to get involved in the chat as we go forward. So please like, subscribe, chat, and with that said, let's dive in. So as you may have noticed from the last couple of weeks, we've got a bit of a established format now, and that is we do a bit of a review of the latest data, if there's anything interesting, and then both myself and my co-host we'll have introduced one topic each to do a quick rant on ourselves, and then banter back and forth and interact with you, our audience. So with that said, starting off with, oh, wait a second, no, I missed a part. See, there you go. Proving once again that this is live and casual. We are trying to also remind everyone of events coming up. And now a big one, since I'm about to talk about China, we've actually got a China event, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, in conjunction with the Epoch Times, hosting a screening of an Epoch Times China documentary. That is tomorrow night in Brisbane. So if you can get along to that, you can see the links to get your tickets underneath this on Facebook or YouTube. If you look at the write-up underneath the screen, you should be able to see where you can go get those links. So we'll be screening that documentary, and then afterwards commentary by Dr Sean Lin, George Christensen, former MP, the National Party up in Dawson, which I believe is based around Mackay, an interesting commentator on all things spicy, and myself. And we'll be doing some commentary Q&A after the event. So we look forward to seeing you if you can get along to that event in Brisbane. Epoch Times is also hosting the same documentary in Sydney the next night, so a day later. And the CIS is running a series of China events. They had their Brisbane one last week. Went along to that. It was quite interesting. And they're hosting that same event in Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra. And the links again under this video. We also have, as I said last week, and I'll say it every week until you buy your ticket, and then I'll keep saying it, the Friedman Conference coming up, the 7th to the 9th of July. Early bird tickets are available, alsfc.com.au. So we've got some of the speakers listed up there now, more speakers to come. So please get your tickets to that and look forward to seeing you there. And one other event, the Church and State Conference in Brisbane. I believe it's the 3rd and 4th of March. So that's coming up even sooner. And that's going to be based in Brisbane. The Friedman Conference based in Sydney, Church and State, the next conference based in Brisbane. So have a look at all those. The link's available under this video. Get along if you can. It's great to talk to people online. I appreciate it. I really do. But there's something extra meaningful about getting along to these in-person events, seeing the whites of people's eyes, being able to share a beer and swap some banter in person. So try to get along to those if you can. On economic update news, I think I was just chatting to Jean before we went live. There's not much new data dumps in the last week, except for one thing that I found very interesting. And I don't think I can actually bring this up now because I don't think I had set this up. So, Jean, you quickly tell me while I look for this. Any new data coming in the last week that I've missed?
Not that I'm aware of, John. So, well, not that stuck out to me. I mean, the big thing in the last week, but I think you covered it last week, didn't you? The interest rate increase from the Reserve Bank. That's what everyone's talking about and wondering what that's going to do to the economy.
3.35, I think. I don't know. This is not a very economic point. I don't know if I'm the only one who's letting my implicit OCD bug me that they're keeping it at 3.35. But for years, for decades on end, our interest rates always ended with either a 0 or a 0.5 or a 0.25. Yeah. Sorry, they'd go in 25 basis point increments. So it was always 25 basis points. So it would be 3.25 or 3.5. And right now it's off kilter. It's 3.35. It bugs me. I hope they end up rounding it just to fix my OCD, but we'll see how that goes. Most people are estimating it'll continue going up to 3.85. And I have no better estimate than that. So there you go. Now, the new data point, this isn't new to this week. It came out a couple of weeks ago, but I don't think it's been commented on anywhere. And that's probably because most normal people don't keep an eye on the MFS, the monthly financial statements put out by the Department of Finance, because why would you? That's not a thing a normal person does. Thankfully for you, I do it, so you don't have to. So the latest MFS, it tells you how the government's finances are going, their revenue and expenses month by month. And it gives us a little insight to where the budget is tracking. So normally twice a year on budget and my EFO night, we get told the budget updates. And before the budget updates, we get very scant information. So this has got a bit of information here that might tell us how we're tracking. So as a reminder, the current financial year, 2022/23, the current financial year was estimated to have a budget deficit of just under 40 billion, about 37 billion. I can put it, highlighting that here. Now, as a further reminder, if you go back a year, it was actually estimated to be 80 billion. And then in the last budget, that was revised down to just under 40. So that's a great improvement. The interesting thing here, the MFS data is showing that we are on track to actually see that deficit decrease further. Indeed, I would hazard, based on current trajectory, it looks likely that the current year's deficit could halve again from about 40 down to about 20. You can see here, this is if you can see, I think you can see where my mouse is moving. Is that right, Jim?
Yeah. It's small, but you can see it, yeah.
Now let's see if I can increase that a bit. This column in gray. This column in gray is showing the actual, what's happened year to date up till the end of December. And you can see here, year to date, we're running at $15 billion deficit. But according to the budget, we should be at a $26 billion deficit year to date. So we're running 12 billion ahead of schedule. And you can see that if we kept running according to schedule, we'll hit 37, but we're already running 12 billion ahead of schedule. So we're running nearly on track to hit about a $20 billion deficit instead of a $40 billion deficit. So probably you heard it here first, write it down here. There's a couple of things to note about that. One is, this is good news. It is good to get our budget under control. Our budget has been in deficit for far too long. It's been racking up further debt. So deficit is the flow, debt is the stock. Every time you have a deficit, it adds to your debt. And we've had a deficit for far too long in this country. The government budget needs to be brought under control. And this indicates that it is on track. It is moving towards balance. So that is a piece of good news. But I want to add two quick caveats or warnings around this. One is that this is on track so far before the government started announcing further policies. So it's so often a budget, I do this every year come budget time. I look at what would be the natural improvement in the budget, naturally, and then how much did the government screw it up by adding new spending or new stupid policies that take away that improvement. So we haven't seen that yet. I would strongly encourage this government, if they have the intestinal fortitude, lock in these gains. Do not fall for the siren call of we've got more money now, we can spend it, we can sprinkle it around and buy more votes. The budget should be balanced. Let's lock in these improvements and actually start improving the balance. That's the first warning. It should be banked, it should be locked in. The second warning is that sadly, as you can see here, most of this improvement has come from receipts. They call it receipts. To you and me, it's known as taxes. The government taking our money without our permission, which no one else is allowed to do. And you'll see here, at this point, we were supposed to have about 290, and we're actually closer to 300 billion coming in year to date up until now, which firstly is just an eye-wateringly high number. But secondly, that explains most of the improvement. And that is a bit unfortunate, right? I mean, this is ideally, we'd want to see the budget being improved through spending restraint. And there is a bit of spending restraint here. You can see it was supposed to be up to 316 and instead it's 313. So that's a little bit of good news. But there's three things to take away. Firstly, improving the budget is good. Secondly, they need to not spend that money. Now that the budget's improving, don't take that as a license to spend. And thirdly, taxes are going up too high. The budget is improving on the back of you and I working people. And this reinforces the need for another round of tax cuts. Now, I know stage 3 hasn't yet come into force yet because it was planned too far into the future and we're still waiting for it. But we need to start talking now about stage 4. We need further tax cuts. We can't allow the budget to only improve off the back of the productive sector, of continually fleecing the productive sector. So no, Tim, I'm not going to... what is this? This comment coming in here. 3 cheers for taxes. As I was saying, I want those taxes cut. This is the wrong way to be balancing the budget. And this shows the degree to which governments have been relying too much on fleecing the productive sector to try and fix their budget problems. So but anyway, the new piece of news for you is the budget seems to be trending in a better direction than we expected. And I don't think that was public information yet. So there you go. That's your new piece of, what do you make of that, Gene?
Well, I think Jim Chalmers has commented on this to an extent. And so Chalmers was saying that they will be banking the gains from higher commodity prices. I think a lot of that revenue improvement's been due to commodity prices staying higher for longer, if I remember correctly. And he is also saying that we're not going to get back into surplus anytime soon. So he's not saying we're going to get back to surplus. So we're still going to run deficits. Now, John, I think this is an interesting point you make about you're wanting to go to stage 4. You've just made the point that they're not cutting expenses. So like they've got a challenge just paying for or keeping their budget under control if they go ahead with stage 3. So what do you see happening with if you do stage 4 tax cuts? Are you advocating a starve the beast strategy, or do you have a program of cuts you have in mind?
Well, if you ask me what I would cut, yes, I would cut plenty and I would cut deep, but I don't think the Labor government is necessarily going to take my advice on that. Yeah, there's 3 parts to this puzzle, as you'd well know. Is the tax revenue you've got coming in. I want tax rates cut. Then you've got the budget. I want the budget balanced. And so there's only the third part of that left, and which is spending. And therefore, yes, I want spending to be reduced. I think the bureaucracy is far too big. I think there's far too much churn. I think you could deeply cut taxes and middle class welfare in a way where you didn't leave anyone worse off, but you significantly shrunk the size of the state. And I think there's plenty of extra projects and corporate welfare that we don't need in this country, and ways to improve social spending that would decrease the cost to taxpayers and potentially still improve the quality of that social spending. So yeah, I am an out-and-out advocate of decreasing the size of government spending. I understand too many people in politics, the easiest thing to do is to say, I want to cut tax, increase spending, and fix the budget. And with all due respect to my friends in the UAP, that is sometimes a little bit the magic pudding approach that has been promised to us by Clive in the past. It doesn't add up. We all know that doesn't add up. You have to address one of the difficult questions. So either admit that you're increasing taxes, that's what the Greens do. Admit that you don't care about debt and deficits. That seems to be what all American politicians these days do. Or come out and say, yes, I'm going to cut spending. I might cut spending on something you like. I understand you don't like that, and you might not vote for me because of it. It's perhaps why I have not been a particularly successful politician. I will cut some spending, and it might include some spending that you like, but I think it's the only responsible thing to do, because it's irresponsible to keep racking up debt. I think it is irresponsible for the economy not to pursue microeconomic reform, including tax cuts, to drive productivity, to drive the long-run growth of our economy, which is the thing that makes us all more prosperous in the long run. And given those two things need to be done, the only responsible way to square that circle is to say, yes, I want to cut government spending as well. So is that too blunt?
No, that's good, John. I just wanted to talk to you about that, and because you was talking about stage 4, and I thought, sounds great, but what are we going to cut? And I think maybe we could go through that in a future episode. We could talk about, well, this is what the government's spending money on. This is where we think we could have substantial cuts. I mean, it's not just going to be, it's got to be more than industry assistance. It does have to go to programs that are popular. So with quite a significant number of people, so it would be politically challenging.
You'd be surprised at how much money is actually used up in churn, where the money is taken off a middle class family, passed through a string of bureaucrats, and then given back to that same family, either in that year or in a year soon afterwards. That actually makes up hundreds of billions of dollars of spending each year. It is a crazy high number. Now, it would require some nuance and finesse to be able to end that churn. It's not quite as simple as saying, be gone, churn. But there is a lot that could be done in that space, and plenty of other spaces too. Melissa's comment here, how about getting rid of the federal health and education departments? Do they actually do anything, considering they are taken care of by the states? Melissa, I very much agree. The Federal Department of Education doesn't run a school. The Federal Department of Health doesn't run a hospital. These things are run at the state level. Even then, I don't think they should be run by the state governments. I prefer them to be run by private industry and competitive. And to the degree that people need help, you give them vouchers. But as a first step, I think they should be left to the states. It does get a little bit messy because the states currently don't have much access to revenue. So this is why I go back to one of my bugbears, and maybe I'll make this a future rant on a future episode, that I think we need to have the states be more responsible for their own revenue. And I think the only realistic way of doing that would be to shift the income tax from a federal tax to a state tax. But that is... I backed Turnbull's proposal when he came out with it prior to that COAG in 2016, that the federal government give over some of the income tax powers to the states so they could piggyback on it. I thought that sounded like a sensible direction, but then it turned out it was just a thought bubble from Turnbull, and it didn't go anywhere. It didn't survive the 24-hour media cycle. So it was all a bit disappointing that we lost that opportunity to have that discussion back then. Yeah, I believe Abbott also floated that balloon and ran away from it. Politicians seem to be a bit scared of the pushback. Look, it's a fun topic. It's worthy of time. I think I'm going to pencil this one in and do a deep dive. I'll do a rant on it in a future week. But we probably don't have the time to dive into it now. It is a deep topic. So let's then dive into our first topic today. And with your indulgence, Gene, I think I'll take the screen and talk a little bit about China. And then we'll bring you back on. Now, talking about China, there is a lot happening about China lately. You would have seen the spy balloon floating over America, which made everyone very excited. The Chinese, of course, locked a lot of their citizens in their houses for a long period of time over the last 3 years, especially last year. They're just letting them out, which is fairly big news on the world stage. And a lot of people are talking about the role of China in the world stage, whether it's good, bad, somewhere in between, and importantly, then what to do about it. When I say everyone's talking, the CIS is doing their tour talking about China. Check that out if you can. And as I mentioned earlier, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance and the Epoch Times are putting on their documentary, the Epoch Times documentary, tomorrow night. So I hope to see you along at that event if you are free in Brisbane during that time. But I think there's a lot to unpack about China, certainly far more than I can do in this live rant right now, but I wanted to touch on a few things. One is probably something that I don't need to convince most of the people listening to this of, but it is still something that is people are only becoming aware of in recent years. And that is the rise of China has significant threatening elements to it. So Neil Ferguson claimed, and I think he's correct, he made this claim in 2019, that there already is a Cold War going on between the US and China. People talk about an emerging Cold War. He claimed in 2019 that it's no longer emerging, it is now here. So we fought in the second half of the 20th century, the Western world had a Cold War with the communist world, led by the Soviet Union, so the USA versus the Soviet Union and their various allies. And that Cold War was, well, I was about to say it was fought. It was never actually fought as a hot war, but that conflict was ongoing for decades, which was a defining feature of the second part of the 20th century. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, we became a unipolar world with America basically running the show. And we are now back at, according to Neil Ferguson, and I think he's correct, we are back in a Cold War footing, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable because there's been a lot of talk about, China being a competitor, a strategic competitor, but just another country in the world stage. And there was originally, a few years ago at least, a bit of concern that we don't want to talk this up as a conflict. Now, when I talk this up as a conflict, I don't mean to imply this is a conflict I want. This is not a normative statement about preference. This is my best effort at a positive statement about observing the world. A positivist statement, not positive as in it's good, but positive as in a discussion of reality, not a discussion of my preferences. And I think, sadly, this is the situation we're in, but I also think to a degree, it is an inevitable situation. And I think it's important for us to understand that a little bit. There is a thing called a Thucydides trap, named after the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who was writing at the time about the rise in the power of Athens and how this was spooking the old power, being Sparta, and how this situation, the rise of a new power next to an old power, was, as he would argue, inevitably going to lead to some sort of conflict. And it's hard to imagine how this is avoided in reality. So it's easy to say, on one side, China's rising, challenging America. China shouldn't do that. They're very bad. All right, sure, you can say that if you like, but China is rising. They are rising and they are becoming a superpower. What do we expect? And on the other side, you could say, well, America should just go away calmly and pass the world to China. That's never happened. That is an unrealistic expectation on both counts, saying America should just step aside for China, or China shouldn't bother rising, and if they do rise, they shouldn't want superpower status. Put aside what you'd prefer, those are both entirely unreasonable expectations of the world. That's not how the world works. That's not how geopolitics works. Countries enjoy being powerful. They enjoy being superpowers if they can. And if they have superpower levels of economic influence and diplomatic influence, the idea that they'll just sit back and play second fiddle and never get involved in geopolitics is naivety on steroids. Now, looking into the Thucydides trap, a couple of years ago, I've forgotten the name of the author, I'll put it in the chat later. There was a wonderful book looking into the Thucydides trap as it applied in modern history. By modern history, the author was referring to the last 500 years, and he found 16 examples where there was a dominant superpower that was being challenged by a rising superpower nearby. And by nearby, they don't have to be geographically nearby. In this day and age, China and America are close enough to be potential adversaries here. So an existing superpower being challenged by a rising superpower. And of those 16 occasions, 12 times it led to a shooting war. 12 out of 16. Those aren't great odds, right? I mean, that's 75%. 75% of the times, a rising power challenging an established power leads to a hot war. Those aren't good odds. It's kind of what you would expect, but nonetheless, it's a little bit scary. Now, of those 4 examples that didn't lead to a shooting war, the 4 good examples, 4 peaceful examples, I've got to point out one of those was the Cold War between the USA and the Soviet Union. That goes down in this book as a good example of peace. So this is a scary scenario, and I just want to paint this story. Firstly, if you didn't think there was much of a threat from China, firstly, I'd like to slap you out of that opinion. I'd like to disabuse you of that opinion. This is a challenging situation. But secondly, if you think that this is a challenging situation just because one side is being mean and stubborn, both sides are following pretty logically their own internal incentives. And this is sadly a situation that we shouldn't be surprised by. But we do have to prepare for it. I'm not saying we want it. I'm not saying we shouldn't be surprised by it, but we do have to be prepared for it and look for how it can be managed. By the way, the examples of the Thucydides trap not leading to war was nearly always 2 countries nearby each other that were friends with each other replacing each other. So the US replacing the UK, Germany replacing the UK in the late 20th century with the EU, and Spain replacing Portugal some 500 years ago. So it's hard to imagine that the China-US situation is analogous to the US eclipsing the UK. The US and UK were quite culturally interlinked to some degree. It was just a continuation of the same cultural dominance of the English-speaking world. So it should be a scary situation. But I want to warn people against framing it as, why is China doing this? I want to give some context. Like, I think China is genuinely dangerous. I'm not trying to apologize for China, but I want to give some context here. If you look at recent history, America has been the dominant country for, say, the last 100 years. Right? In that context, a new country, a new upstart country trying to challenge America, it looks like the other country is the upstart, challenging the dominant leader, potentially tipping the global order off balance. And I think that's often how it is perceived by Americans and by a lot of people watching the current changes in geopolitics. If you take a slightly longer version of history, if you take a version of history that goes back, say, 3,000 years, which is during the period where most of the interesting stuff happened in history, during that time, it's not much of a stretch to say that China was, for most of history, arguably the dominant power on Earth. They had the Zhou dynasty, which was analogous to the European Greek period. They had the Han dynasty, which was comparable in size and technological advancement in the Roman Empire. They had the Song dynasty, which was far more advanced than Europe during the Middle Ages and introduced gunpowder and writing. You had then the Yuan dynasty, the descendants of Genghis Khan, who took over most of the world, right? You had the Ming dynasty, which sailed around the world when most people were still in rowboats. And then you had the early Qing dynasty before the Enlightenment, before the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe. Qing dynasty China made up 1/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of the world's GDP. 1/3 in one country, right? The world is still a big place, but 1/3. So if a silly way of thinking of it, but if aliens came to Earth through most of history on an average year and an average decade, and they said to Earth, take me to your leader, it's a silly thing to consider, but imagine it. Right now, you'd take them to America, obviously, right? Go back 100 years, you take them to London. Go back a couple of hundred more years before that, it would have been, perhaps Amsterdam, before that Madrid. But through most of history, the aliens would be taken to China. So if you see history through this lens, China being the center of the world, and most of the time being the center of the world through their economic dominance, leading to their then cultural and military dominance, then the last 100 years, or the last 200 years really, are the anomaly. 200 years ago, they made up 1/3 of the world's GDP. Then the country imploded. They missed out on the Industrial Revolution. They had their century of humiliation. They had their ridiculous experiment with Maoist communism that killed more people than ever in the history of the world. But then as they rise again, from the Chinese perspective, they're not the little new upstart, right? They're not the new Johnny-come-lately on the block. They were the center of the world for millennia, and they're re-rising to their position that they find normal. Now, you might not agree with that, but it is important to factor in that that's how many people in China think. right? And we can't just wish away the way they see the world, right? They do literally have economic power and military power. We do need to understand them. We do need to understand the situation. From their situation, they're not an upstart challenging the dominant America. They are the dominant country that slipped for 150 years, and they're coming back to their position of power, and they want to be treated as though they are a world superpower. And this is going to create the conflict. And it's somewhat of an inevitable. I'm not trying to paint either side as good or bad when I say that. I'm just saying that this conflict is likely to happen. Where is it going to go to from here? Well, this is where I start to actually paint the one side as the goodie and one side as the baddie, because I am significantly worried about the direction China is trending. But I do think it's important to understand the problem with modern China. The problem with Xi Jinping's China is sometimes described as China is going back to their communist ways, or perhaps China was always communist and they tricked us for a little while, and now they're going back to their hardcore communist ways. And I think there is a dangerous thing that's happened in China lately, and it's dangerous for the world, but I don't think it's communism. I understand they call themselves the Communist Party, but if I can call myself lots of things, it doesn't make me those things. I need to be careful the examples I use now because the world's gone mad. But I can call myself a car, it doesn't make me a car, right? So China was a communist country under Mao Zedong, and under Mao Zedong, they experimented in quite radical communism, and it killed tens of millions of people. It is responsible. Mao Zedong and his communist experiments are responsible for more deaths than anyone else in history. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong is responsible for more deaths than Hitler and Stalin combined. It is a remarkably evil empire at that time that did a remarkably terrible thing. And so that was communism, and that was communism failing. And China was not taking over the world under that. They were not getting rich. They were only getting poorer. They were getting poorer and violent, and they were dying. That was China's communist experiment. Then I would argue around 1980, they went in a different direction. Under Deng Xiaoping and then Jiang Zemin, sorry, as I said, live show, this is what you get. Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, they went on a different direction where, of course, they just called it socialist still. They still call themselves a communist party, but they basically allowed a massive expansion in the private sector. They shrunk the size of government and a massive expansion of the private sector, and they experimented with basically capitalism. Now, not complete capitalism, but no one has complete capitalism. Neither do we in America or in Australia or in the Western world. So China experimented with markets. And you might say, look, this is just an absolute coincidence. Who would have thought it? But exactly the time they did that, people started coming out of poverty. People stopped dying of starvation. Now, I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's something we should wish away or just wave away and say, no, they're always communist. They just put lipstick on a pig. They significantly changed their economic policies. They significantly changed them in a totally different direction. And then when they did that, people started coming out of poverty. Now, I'm not saying that everything Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin did was good, because they did a lot of terrible things as well. But in terms of learning lessons from China, we can learn from Mao Zedong, if we need to learn it again, that communism kills people. And we can learn from Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin that switching to markets helps make your country richer and brings people out of poverty. There's been 500 million people brought out of poverty in China in the last 30 or 40 years. This amounts to 40,000 people, 40,000 being brought out of poverty every day. 40,000 today, 40,000 tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, every day of the week, every week of the month, every month of the year, 40,000. 365 days a year, every year for 30 or 40 years. That's an insane statistic. It's hard to imagine anyone that you will ever meet in your life bringing 40,000 people out of poverty. But that's just one day. I mean, if you just spent the rest of your life dedicated to only doing good and only helping people, do you think you could bring 40,000 people out of dire, absolute starvation level poverty? It's hard to imagine. But the Chinese switch towards markets helped achieve that. And I think while there's plenty to worry about with China under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, I don't mean to downplay their human rights abuses, there is an economic lesson to be learned there. And that is that China in the 80s, 90s, and noughties was no longer a socialist state. It was switching to a market economy, a dictatorial market economy, more Pinochet than Stalin at that point. Then, and I think this is hugely important, about 10 years ago, when Xi Jinping came in, there was another significant change in direction. Now, China, introducing Mao and those socialist experiments, massive change. Switching from Mao to Deng, I would argue another massive change. And I would argue there has been about 10 years ago, and over the last 10 years, another massive change in China. The Xi Jinping and the current regime, they are not a continuation of Deng. And so some people say, all right, so he's gone back to Mao Zedong levels. I would argue he's also not a continuation of Mao. Xi Jinping's model is the merger, and you guys may remember this. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Let me know if you remember these words. The merger of big business and big government. So he's reinventing Jim Chalmerism before Jim Chalmers. Mm-hmm. But this is a model that has been used before, and as I said a couple of weeks ago, the model being used by Xi Jinping is not new, it's not unique, it's precisely what was put down in the blueprint by Mussolini a century ago. We have seen this game. Xi Jinping is a danger to the world. The model of economics he is promoting is a terrible one and a dangerous one and will leave his country down a dark path. But it is more fascism than socialism. And I don't mean to say that one's better than the other, or that means we should worry about it more or should worry about it less. I just think that the best way of addressing any problem is to first correctly identify the problem. I think that is the first step when you're going to try and address a problem. So where is China going to go next? Currently, they're going down a very dark path, I believe. I think the danger of going down this Xi Jinping pseudo-fascist path is a couple of fold. That they are getting more belligerent. And I worry about the rising nationalism potentially sparking off the Thucydides trap. And this is what a lot of people have talked about before. And of course, Taiwan is a dangerous tipping point or a dangerous location in that balance. I'm going to say a redeeming feature, this is a strange thing to say, is a redeeming feature. I do believe that fascist economics doesn't work as well as capitalist economics. I think about China, they are going to become more dangerous as a geopolitical player. They're going to become more nationalistic, belligerent, and hostile. But I don't think they're going to continue getting as rich as they used to. I think this is a prediction. We don't know. We'll have to see it play out. But already we saw 3% growth in China last year. We already saw their growth coming down from 10% levels, down to 8% levels, down to 6% levels. Now even their bounce back is supposed to be to less than 6%. IMF is predicting that the Chinese growth rates will then trend down to below 4% without structural reform, meaning without switching back to markets. And I think that is a roughly correct prediction. So this is something to look out for in China. If their growth continues to slow, which I think if they continue with their fascist experiment, it will continue to slow, they may never catch America. So the big economic threat, I think, is mitigated by them becoming fascist, but the military and nationalistic threat is increased. Now, they could go a different path. They could actually embrace structural reform and go back to more markets, shrink the size of the state in the economy, privatize the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, remove the government involvement from the current businesses, allow small businesses to flourish instead of propping up the big businesses, which is what they're currently doing. They could go back to that Deng Xiaoping approach, and I think then their economy would continue to grow, but then it's not clear whether they would remain as much of a nationalistic, belligerent country. Maybe they would. Maybe that's dangerous. This is an unknown path. At the moment, it doesn't look like they're going down that path. The other approach is they could go full Mao. But if they go full Mao, I think they will destroy their economy completely. The other option is the Kumbaya approach of embracing Western liberal democracy, which is the end of history Francis Fukuyama approach that people used to daydream about a decade or two ago. And I think it's becoming clear that that outcome is very unlikely. But these are the possible outcomes looking forward. I am very worried about the Xi Jinping pseudo-fascist approach. But the only redeeming feature is I don't think fascism is a good economic model. Capitalism will outperform fascism in the long term. If they pursue a fascist experiment, we will win the economic battle, which is the long-term battle. So there's a little bit of a white pill at the end of this little rant. There is so much to cover about China, but I've already been going long enough, so I'm going to stop now. So, Gene, what do you reckon?
Well, yes, I've got a couple of questions, John. But first, I just noticed someone's asking in the chat, Elizabeth is asking, is Dr. Sean Lin going to be a guest? That's for your event tomorrow, isn't it? That's Sean is at that event, isn't he?
That's correct. Yeah, he's going to be speaking at our event tomorrow, Wednesday night in Brisbane. I believe he's also speaking at the Epoch Times event in Sydney on Thursday night. So yes, he will be there, Elizabeth, and I hope you'll be there too. So grab your tickets. Link below the video.
Okay, so John, I thought I'd ask, you mentioned rising Chinese nationalism. How do you see that playing out? Do you see it playing out similar to Japanese imperialism in the the 30s and the 40s, or do you see it more like the Boxer Rebellion and let's kick out all the foreigners? I mean, a revenge for the century of humiliation. So how does this actually play out? I mean, my feeling is that China's not particularly imperialistic. I mean, it wants Taiwan back. There's no doubt about that. But through history, I mean, has it really been an imperial power beyond its borders? How do you see it playing out?
These are very good questions. When you say beyond their borders, the first thing that comes to mind is which borders do you mean? Because if every time you have a successful imperial war, you just expand your borders, then you can always say that it's within your borders. So it's not just the Taiwan in that instance, but of course everyone would have heard about Tibet. Everyone has heard about Xinjiang, although you may not have heard that term. That's where the Muslims kept in internment camps up in the northwest of China. So it's not obvious these places are an internal matter. It seems like an internal matter for now, but that's the first question. Beyond that, though, I think you're right. China tends to pick fights with occasionally their border neighbors, but they don't tend to sail around the world to colonize the world. They missed out on that part of history. So I think you're right to say that they're not necessarily, I don't think they necessarily have imperialist ambitions. The thing I worry about from this, and I got this from John Lee, an Australian Chinese scholar, an Australian-based China scholar, who points out that the maintenance of the Chinese Communist Party at the head of the Chinese state, right? They get their power. They used to have their power from ideological adherence, right? Under Mao, the idea was we are communist, communism is better, we are better, stay loyal to the good side. There's not much of that anymore, right? Firstly, China hasn't been communist for 40 years. And secondly, there's not much to look at about communism that inspires loyalty anymore. I mean, its track record has been of failure, and that's easy enough to see everywhere outside of North Korea. So that's not where the CCP gets their loyalty. For the past couple of decades, they've got their loyalty from two places: economic growth, we are making you richer, and nationalism, right? We're helping you get over the embarrassment of the century of humiliation. We are bonding together, and we are making China great again. For the Chinese equivalent of embracing Trump's catchphrase there, making China great again. And those were the two pillars that meant that a lot of Chinese people continue to support the CCP and the Chinese state. And while you had strong economic growth, you were fulfilling that, right? People felt better because their country was stronger, but they also felt better because they were richer. Fewer of their family members starved to death. More people had jobs, and had jobs that paid them enough so that they could actually buy trinkets. So it was in some way an acceptable trade to many Chinese people. Keep making me rich and I will stay loyal. Part of what I worry about with the future is I don't think fascism works long-term as an economic model. It can work short-term, but not long-term, in my opinion. I think they are already starting to see their economy slow down. Their return on capital is diminishing significantly. They've got a massive savings glut and increasingly few places to put that, because they are starting to over-regulate the economy. All of the easy investments have been done, and the rest of the economy is over-regulated. So I think the engines of Chinese growth is slowing. And then they'll try to spike it by printing a bunch of money, and I don't think it'll work. And they'll try to spike it in a few other ways. I don't think it'll work. If the economy slows down, remember, two things that had people's loyalty: the economy and nationalism. You take away, that's unfortunate which finger I'll leave up. All right, I'll take this finger away. You take away the economy, and it only leaves the nationalism. If people start being skeptical of their government, what is the way the government, what could the government lean into to try and ensure loyalty of their people? What I fear they'll lean into is nationalism. They will beat their chest, not because I think China is an inherently imperialist country, but because I think the CCP wants to maintain the support of the people. They want to stay in power. They don't want to be couped. They don't want a revolution. they will lean into what gets them support. And if it's not economic growth, I think it'll be nationalism. The most obvious place to do that is Taiwan, right? I mean, that is a very popular thing in China, to try and retake Taiwan, and they'll claim it's not imperialist. And I worry that if the economy is taking a downturn and the Chinese people are getting restless, quite an obvious sort of Machiavellian, strategic, somewhat evil, I don't want it, but understandable choice by their politicians would be to lean into war with Taiwan. So that's my fear. That's why I worry about the rising nationalism. I mean, China's always been quite a nationalist, and may as well just say it's a fairly racist country. But that's not necessarily going to lead to imperialism or geopolitical drama. But in the context I just described, I worry that it could lead to that sort of geopolitical instability.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you make about, after I said, oh, well, they don't want to be expansionists beyond their borders, but then there's a question of what's their borders. And if you look around at some of the countries around there, they have at times been under the, they've been vassal states of China, if I think correctly. Is that?
Well, you don't have to go back too far before you'd say that the entire northeast of China is a different country. I mean, the Manchu people, the Qing dynasty in China, which was the last dynasty before the dynasties fell and you had the nationalist government in the 20th century, the Qing dynasty was at the time considered an external dynasty, right? It was considered that it was non-Chinese people running the Qing dynasty because they were Manchu people. Where are Manchu people from? The northeast 3 provinces of China. That's now just considered China, right? We're just supposed to forget that, right? Star Wars Jedi mind trick, forget the history of the Manchuria. So yes, there's lots of parts of China that didn't used to be part of China. Although one of the things that the Chinese culture has done fairly well historically is when they butt heads with nearby cultures, civilizations, groups, countries that are hostile. The Manchus used to be quite a warlike people. They battle them, sometimes lose the fight, but they win the cultural battle by actually including then the Manchu people in the Chinese customs and cultures. And so that the Manchu people learn to speak Chinese. That's a bad explanation, actually, because there's too many dialects in China. But the equivalent of that, the Manchu people take on the Chinese customs. Even though the Manchu people won the war and took over China, it was the Han Chinese culture that ended up winning over the Manchu people. And to some degree that in Inner Mongolia as well. And to some degree that in parts of Tibet and Xinjiang, these places are being Hananized, slowly being taken over by Han Chinese, both people and culture. The south of China, right, has had a very different culture for a long time. That's all kind of been patched together and we just call it one country. And you get into a lot of trouble with Chinese people if you ever open up the hint that perhaps there could be several countries there. Although to be fair, I'm an equal opportunity troublemaker. I say the same thing about America, right? There could be at least 4 countries in America too.
Yeah. And what about Japan? So I remember, was it Richard McGregor, the national security scholar? He was, or journalist with Financial Times, I'm trying to remember, but I remember he wrote a book several years ago and he was arguing the big tension in that region is between China and Japan, and we don't understand enough just how much of a tinderbox that is. So I don't know if you've done any thinking on that, John.
Yeah, and this is another reason why some countries are so worried about Taiwan falling. So some responses in the West is, well, in the grander scheme of things, letting Taiwan fall would be better than World War III. But you got to remember, letting Taiwan fall is probably not the end of that geopolitical game. If Taiwan falls to China, that means China controls the first island chain, right? I mean, it basically then controls all of that waters in the near ocean next to China. And it basically makes it very easy for China to control the ocean around South Korea and Japan. It makes those 2 countries extremely vulnerable to Chinese power. And then the only real options are those countries fall into line and become semi-vassal states, which you could, I guess, that might be possible to imagine for Korea. It's hard to imagine the Japanese going along with that, or eventually breaking point and sparking some sort of conflict. And so Japan got a very strong vested interest in being worried about the Chinese going after Taiwan, which is why Japan's a very invested player in the Quad: America, Japan, India, and Australia. All right, I forgot the 4th country, but it's us. All right. So yeah, Japan is an ongoing tension. I think the interesting part is going to be the various alliances that form. And this is another part of the, look, it's easy to get black-pilled about China. And sometimes if I'm speaking to people who aren't worried about China, then I will give a very pessimistic story. I will talk about the dangers of rising fascism and the nationalism and these potential wars and Taiwan potentially sparking a World War III and, have your kids learned to shoot yet? Because they might need to soon. So I like to give people the black pill if they're being optimistic. But if people are already suitably worried, and they should be worried, then I like to give a few pieces of sort of a white pill story. And one of the ones was what I was talking about before, that I think ultimately capitalism beats fascism in terms of an economic model. But another part of the white pill is China doesn't have many allies. I mean, they've kind of got Russia at the moment, but that's kind of a coalition of convenience because they have mutual enemies. There has historically been a lot of animosity between those two countries. Japan is a natural rival. India is a natural rival. Most of the ASEAN countries are very annoyed that China keeps trying to steal the South China Sea. So there's not many natural allies for China. So that's another thing to keep in mind when people paint this story of China taking over the world. Well, wait a second, right? A lot of the African countries are kind of rebelling against the China soft imperialism of their heavy-handed, quote-unquote, aid in Africa. So it's not clear that they're going to be able to take the world with them. So that's another sort of white pill moment for people who are worried about the great Chinese takeover. And of course, the other thing to note about skepticism of the great Chinese takeover is their population is about to implode. Right? So 1.4 billion people now, but within the next, within the next couple of decades, or perhaps within a decade, India will overtake China as the most populous country in the world. And before the end of this century, China will, on current trajectory, have fewer than 1 billion people. So their population is going to be going backwards quicker and earlier than other countries. And that is going to be an interesting thing for them to try and deal with. I believe you raised that on a previous episode.
Yeah. I think India may already, if it hasn't already, it's close to overtaking China if you look at the UN projections. So yeah, that's very close. And what's happening with that old age dependency ratio is unbelievable. So yeah, we chatted about that a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's probably worth us going back to that, doing another deep dive later. But for the moment, I have taken up enough of our time on my China rant. So I believe you have quite a different topic to regale us with.
I want to just extend on the chat we had about Jim Chalmers' value-based capitalism a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that Jim Chalmers wants to do is renovate the RBA. So that was his word. And there's this review of the RBA going on at the moment that the RBA didn't want to have, but there's just been so much criticism about the RBA and how they've been running monetary policy, at least for several years now. It's not just over the last couple of years. It's been since a bit before the pandemic. And so we've got a review now. It's headed by this Canadian. She was a deputy governor of the central bank there, Carolyn Wilkins, and Renee Fry-McKibben's on it. She's at ANU, and also Gordon de Brouwer, who's a bureaucrat. I worked with Gordon in Treasury. I mean, they're all good people, and they're looking at, well, how do we structure the RBA? What sort of governance should it have? What mandate should it have in terms of the inflation target? That sort of thing. So that's going to report next month, and I'm thinking that we will see some changes to how the RBA runs, and I think some of them will be much needed. There's possibly going to be a monetary policy committee. They may recommend that, so have a committee of experts. So rather than have the board where you've got all these business people on and possibly, this current government might want to put a union rep on, or some reps from the NGOs perhaps. So there'd be a dedicated monetary policy committee. This is something that Peter Tulip from CIS has recommended. And then there's a call for greater transparency to the central bank. There's a concern that we just don't know enough about what's guiding their decision making, why they're making certain calls. And let's have more of a discussion, more of a debate, and just open it up. More press conferences from the governor, So I think there's going to be a really interesting conversation over that over the next few months. What do we do about the Reserve Bank? I think Phil Lowe's gone. So as part of, there'll be this renovation of the RBA, and I think what Jim Chalmers will do is he'll want to get a fresh face in, possibly Carolyn Wilkins, who's running that review, or maybe Guy Debelle. Guy Debelle went over to work for Twiggy Forrest, but that, I think he lasted 6 months there. I don't know what happened there. I think there'll be some significant changes. So that's something I'm keeping an eye on, and I see some interesting comments in the chat. So they'll recommend central bank digital currency. That's certainly something they're investigating. Some people are saying central bank is communist and then abolish it. Well, I mean, I think it'd be difficult to. I mean, we'd need a radical restructure of the system if we were going to get rid of the central bank. I mean, it's at the core of our banking system. But look, I mean, I think, yeah, sure, we can have a debate about whether you have a central bank or not. That's something we could debate in a future episode for sure. So, John, yeah, that's basically what I'm looking at. I think there'll be some possible changes to the way the banks run and how it communicates with the public, and that'll be for the better, because clearly over the last couple of years its performance in that regard hasn't been great, and we saw Phil Lowe really stuff up with that forecast. He'd keep interest rates at 0.1% until 2024. That's really upset a lot of people. So I think he's gone, and they'll take the opportunity to make some changes. So that's all I wanted to say there.
Yeah, look, there'd be ways to improve the central. There's two ways to take this conversation. One is the way that Informed Dissent mentions here: abolish it, introduce a discussion of free banking. When you say it's at the center of our current financial and banking system, I can imagine Informed Dissent sitting at home saying to himself, "Yes, that's my point. Abolish it, tear it down, replace it with free banking." Look, that's an interesting way to go. I like that discussion. But for the moment, if we keep ourselves within or close to the Overton window, what I worry about with this review, and I agree, there's a bunch of things they could potentially improve on, but there's also a bunch of ways they could take this much worse. So remember, before we had the idea of Reserve Bank independence and inflation targeting, we had the idea that central banks could micromanage the economy by sprinkling money into the economy here and there to get full employment and all of these other goals. It's not clear to me when people talk about reforming the Reserve Bank, if you read between the lines, it's not clear that they're not trying to take us a few steps back towards that direction.
Oh, yeah, some of them are, yep.
Yeah, they wrap it up in very nice words like, let's help the people and greater transparency and the rest of it. It's not obvious to me. I think the central bank's made mistakes, but I think it's been insufficiently worried. I think it was insufficiently worried about inflation early on, insufficiently believing in the links between helicopter moneying out to the people and the subsequent inflation that we're all now suffering from. I think they've already, even though they're not particularly political, they're already a bit too astutely aware of the political pressures on them. And so they drop their interest rates too quickly, too low, keep them too low for too long. And I worry that this review is going to tiptoe towards greater political pressure. And the consequence of that is going to be the Reserve Bank stepping away from inflation targeting. I'd like them to get better at it. I worry that they might step away from it. So I've been a bit hesitant. I'm going to wait to see how this plays out, to wait to see what a few more people are saying closer to the time. But I'm not 2 feet in on this idea that getting the bureaucrats to reshuffle the deck chairs in the RBA board is necessarily going to lead to better monetary policy. I mean, long-term solution is free banking and competitive currencies, but within the Overton window, I'll wait and see exactly what they're coming up with before. Right.
Yep. Fair enough. So when they report, we can have that discussion. I just thought I'd bring it up because I had a radio interview on it today with Steve Austin on ABC. So.
Sorry, apologies. Let me know when the internet's back in here.
You're back.
Oh, okay. How wonderful. Clearly, NBN heard what we were saying and didn't agree, so they were shutting us down. Sorry, what were you saying while I was gone?
I was just saying, I think it's hugely topical, and Phil Lowe's going to be appearing. I think you mentioned a couple of times this week before parliamentary committees, so he's just going to get absolutely hammered, and this will be all over the news and in the opinion pages, discussion about the role of the bank, how effective they've been. So I thought it was a good topic to raise tonight.
Yeah, no, it's becoming political, so we have to look into it. And if anything, perhaps it's important to get into the discussion and lean back against it, because I worry that the dominant voice in discussing it is going to be that Reserve Bank Board has been insufficiently considerate of mums and pups and political concerns and the unemployment rate and the rest of it. And all of those things are important, but you should, if you genuinely think things are important, you don't want to just do stuff that sounds good. You want to do stuff that works. You need to find the right instrument for each problem. And if your concern is wages, then the right instrument is productivity reform. If your concern is unemployment, it's labor market regulations. If your concern is inflation, then the issue is monetary policy. And you need to identify the problem correctly so that you can hone in on what the potential solution is, rather than just saying, any one policy can fix anything as long as you hold hands, sing kumbaya, and dream of unicorns riding rainbows. Which is where I'm worried monetary policy will go if left to politicians. Yeah,
for sure.
Having said that, that's probably enough for that. So we've made the hour mark. So it is the time to sign off. I will just remind everyone then. Let's see, I'm going to retake the left of the screen because I'm just more comfortable over there. Apologies, Gene. Remind everyone that we've got our event coming up tomorrow night, the Australian Taxpayers Alliance in conjunction with Epoch Times, hosting a documentary by Epoch Times about China, about the threats of China. So please come along to that if you can. Tickets available underneath this video. And if you missed that screening, then Sydney, there will be, Epoch Times is hosting another screening in Sydney on Thursday. And these documentaries, this is just one part of a series by Epoch Times. They are available on their website. So go and check that out. Well, firstly, come and see us tomorrow. But if you can't do that, then go and check out the Epoch Times website and check out those documentaries. And please, of course, go and get your early bird tickets to the Friedman Conference coming up in July. And while I've got you here, one last time, please like this video. Please subscribe to this channel. Wherever you're watching it, can I please also ask you to go around to the places this is being simulcast and subscribe to all of those channels. So the Australian Taxpayers Alliance on YouTube, we've got the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, Good Source, and my personal page, John Humphreys. And then the three of those again, all on Facebook. And then you can find my personal page on Rumble for the inevitable day when we all get deplatformed by big tech. So please go to those places, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and I will see you again next week. So a reminder, we are here every Tuesday, every week on Tuesday, 7 p.m. Queensland time, 8 p.m. New South Wales, Victoria time. And for the rest of the states, you'll have to work it out yourself. I can't do that easily in my head, but I'm sure you're used to it. So with that, I will say thank you for joining us. Thank you, Gene, once again for joining us. And I'll see you again next week.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget.